Welcome everybody to INE's CCNP boot camp. I am Brian McGann, and I'm going to be the instructor for class. A little bit about myself: I'm a CCIE in routing and switching, service provider, and security. Been doing this for about 10 years now. This coming January will actually be my 10th anniversary for CCIE. And you can see my email address is up there, so any questions you guys have after class or during the week offline, feel free to send me an email about any questions that you have. The goal of class is that we're obviously going to be talking about the technologies that are within the scope of CCNP, and specifically CCNP routing and switching. So the big thing that Cisco likes to keep private about the exam is just the actual exam questions. And when you go to take your CCNA or your CCNP, any of the exams, you have to sign this paper basically saying I'm not going to talk about the actual exam questions. So any questions that you have throughout the week of class, please feel free to ask me. The more that you put into class, the more that you're going to get out of it. But the key is that we're not going to be talking about the actual questions. So we'll talk about all the technologies that are within the scope of the exam, but not really get into the actual questions. So like I said, questions that you have during class, please feel free to ask me. For any offline questions, my email address is there. You can also see it up there. It's bmcgann@ine.com. And a couple of offline resources that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But one that we have is our technical blog that you can get to at blog.ine.com. And if you search through the archives there or you follow along with it, you'll see there's a lot of different types of technical write-ups. But also our online community that you can get to at ieoc.com. And this is a combination of a web form and a mailing list. So there's lots of technical discussion on there. If you're looking for a specific piece of information, it's usually a good resource to search through the archives of it. And there's also another one that I want to mention here that is Cisco support forum for certification, which is the Cisco Learning Network. It's learningnetwork.cisco.com. So this is a pretty good resource as well for the Cisco certifications. A lot of people are having technical discussions here, talking about different topics. And we'll see also, this is where they show the specifics about the exams, like what are the actual topics that are covered in the route exam or the switch exam or the other certifications. So you may want to keep an eye on this as you're going through your preparation. Like I said, any questions that you have, feel free to ask me. But as well offline, there's some other resources that you can get to there. So for class throughout the week, we're going to be starting around 9 a.m. I'll try not to go more than about an hour or so between breaks. So if I get caught up in myself talking, feel free to just tell me to stop where we are and we'll take a break. We'll take lunch around noon for about an hour. And then class is going to end around 5 o'clock, give or take. It really depends on the pace that we get through the material, what type of questions that everybody has, and to try to fit everything in, because we'll see the topic scope for all three of these exams for CCNP. It's going to be a lot for us to cover in 5 days. So in general, the pace of the class is going to be pretty fast, but as you can see, the class is being recorded. So afterwards, everyone is going to have access to these videos to download them, or for streaming access, so you can watch them like on your phone or your iPad or your Android phone, that type of stuff. So don't worry about trying to absorb everything in 5 days. It's simply not going to be possible. So what you do get out of class, that's going to be great, but then as you go through the different resources that we talk about, like the different Cisco Press books, the different general technology books on IP networking, you'll have the ability to come back and watch these videos and then spend time on the equipment actually going through a lot of the examples that I'm doing. Now additionally, everyone is going to have equipment access this week. We're going to be using our CCI routing and switching topology. So everyone is going to have access to 6 routers and 4 switches. And then a little bit later this morning, we'll talk the specifics about how to actually get into that and then how to use those throughout the week. So specifically about the exam, the overall, and about the class, the overall objective of class, if you look at the Cisco specific definition of CCNP, is that we want to plan, implement, verify, and troubleshoot local and wide area enterprise networks, where really the key word here is enterprise networks. That is not only for routing and switching, but also security, voice, wireless video solutions. So we'll talk about how some of these additional topics play into the enterprise network design. But really the goal of class is not just to get everyone to pass the exam, but really to understand how the technologies work. So we're not going to be spending time going through practice questions. We're not going to be talking about the nuances of what's actually on the exam. I'm going to be focusing on all the technologies that are within the scope of layer 2 LAN switching, layer 3 routing, and then additionally some of the router services. And if you really understand at a fundamental level how these technologies work, it doesn't really matter the format of the questions that you get in the exam. Now, as a general prerequisite, hopefully everybody knows that you do need a valid CCNA in order to take any of the CCNP exams. So if you're doing this to actually get the certification and not just learn about the technologies, you would have to go back to CCNA first before you take any of the CCNP exams. But technology-wise, hopefully everybody has a pretty basic understanding of what the OSI model is, the 7 different layers like physical, data link, network. We're not going to be spending too much time on that from like a memorization point of view. We will be talking about it from a network verification and a network troubleshooting point of view. So if we run into problems with IP routing, how do we know to check at layer 3 technologies versus layer 2 or layer 1? But that definitely is going to be within the scope of the exam. TCP/IP, of course, is going to be the main protocol that we're dealing with. So we'll look at both IP version 4 and IP version 6. As long as you have a general working knowledge of how IP networks work, then you should be fine once we get into layer 2 switching and the layer 3 routing. For layer 2 technologies in this exam, it's mainly going to be focusing on Ethernet LAN switching, but there will be some other WAN medias thrown in there like frame relay or PPP. There is a section that touches on wireless LANs as well. Then for layer 3 routing technologies, hopefully everybody has a basic understanding of what IP routing is. How does that work differently than layer 2 switching? And then some of the dynamic IP routing protocols like RIP or EHRP, OSPF. We're going to be going into these in a lot of detail, though, this week. Then some of the miscellaneous things, services like DHCP, DNS, access lists for security, network address translation. This stuff is going to be within the scope as well. But as long as you have a basic understanding of what are other features or services of the network, we're going to get into more details specifically about what's going to be covered. Now, the actual blueprint that we're going to be following along, you can get to if you go to Cisco's website and you go to /go/CCNP. So cisco.com/go/CCNP. And from here, you'll see that there's a couple different tracks that you can go through, or a couple different exam structures you can go through in order to pass the exam. But these 3, route, switch, and T-shoot, these are the current numbers of the exams that are covered. And if you open any of these up, it's going to forward you to the Cisco Learning Network, that web forum that I mentioned before. And in here, specifically, it shows you some of the details like what is the format of the class, or excuse me, format of the exam. So it's a 2-hour exam with 52 questions. The exam tutorial as well shows you just the general interface that you'll use to take the exam. So if you haven't taken a CCNA exam recently, or you haven't taken any of the other Cisco ones, you may want to take a look at this. One thing it also does go over is the simulation questions of the exam. So when you go onto the command line of the switches or the command line of the routers, and you have to make configuration changes or troubleshooting changes in order to solve the question. If you haven't seen that before, you probably do want to take a look at that before you get to the exam. But also under here it says, what are the exam topics? And the order that we're going to be going through this week, we'll go through layer 2 switching, then we'll go through layer 3 routing, and then we'll end up with troubleshooting towards the end of the week. So for the switching exam, if we look at the topics, says the implementing Cisco IP switch network exams for either CCNP or CCDP will certify the successful candidate's important knowledge of skills to plan, configure, verify, and implement enterprise switching solutions, including VLANs, wireless LANs, voice and video. Mainly the focus of this is going to be with the layer 2 wired network. So we will focus a little bit on some of the wireless technologies, but mainly this exam is going to be focusing on layer 2 Ethernet switching. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about the specifics of things like VLANs and trunking and how the switch builds its layer 2 topology and sends traffic through the network. Also some other layer 2 switching features like security, private VLANs, VLAN access lists, port access lists, so how we can control traffic in the layer 2 LAN network. Then for layer 3 services, this will be for routing on the switches, configuring routing interfaces, and then also layer 3 security. Some of this stuff here is going to bleed into the route exam because essentially the layer 3 switches are pretty much the same things as the routers. Just as a difference of having more LAN ports or more LAN interfaces versus like a 2800 or a 2900 series router. So when we look at routing protocols like RIP or OSPF or EIGRP, the syntax of this is going to be the same whether we're doing it on the switches or the routers. So some of this is going to overlap into the route exam. Then also wireless and voice and video. This is not a huge focus of the exam. They don't expect you to configure like a wireless LAN controller or any of the access points or actually configure IP telephony. Mainly where this is going to fit in is when we talk about things like the layer 2 quality of service or the QoS for the LAN network. So if someone is making an IP phone call or someone is watching a video over the network, how do we make sure that that application actually gets the requirements that it needs? Like in terms of things like the delay of the network or of the bandwidth. We do need to take this into account when we're dealing with our layer 2 switched Ethernet LANs. Then also high availability. Things like the first hop redundancy protocols like HSRP or VRRP or GLBP. We'll talk about how from the end host point of view, when it starts to send its traffic into the LAN, what's going to happen if one of the switches goes down, or what happens if there's some sort of software crash, and how can we rebuild the network around that failure. And then also what this is going to relate to is to try to get the minimum downtime for the network as well. So if one of our switches crashes and we have some application that says after 200 milliseconds the application is going to die, we need to make sure that we can take this into account in the layer 2 network design. So specifically within the scope of the exam topics, for the switching exam, mainly we're going to be focusing on the layer 2 Ethernet switching, so things like VLANs, VTP, trunking, spanning tree protocol. Then these features will be covered in here, but this is really where the main focus of switching is going to be. So just getting basic end-to-end connectivity, and then dealing with some customizations of the network like spanning tree or dealing with like bandwidth aggregation through Ether channel. From the routing exam point of view, it's mainly going to be focusing on the IGPs, which isn't listed here, but RIP version 2 would be in there as well. So the IGPs of RIP, EIGRP, and OSPF, these two we're going to go into a lot of detail with, as well as BGP. IPv6 is also covered a little bit. We'll talk about some of the differences between IP version 4 routing and IP version 6. But as you're probably aware, in today's networks, it's not really as widely deployed yet as IP version 4 is. So we'll talk about some of the migration techniques you can use, like IPv6 tunneling or the IPv6 routing protocols. But it's not going to be as big of a focus as these topics. We'll also talk about route redistribution, which a lot of times is a real common problem area for a lot of engineers. That if you don't know the techniques of looking at where could there potentially be a problem with redistribution, how could we run into route feedback or routing loops, and what are the different tools that we can use on the iOS in order to figure out we have these problems and then ultimately fix them and prevent them in the future. For troubleshooting, you'll see that the topics that are covered here are kind of a culmination of everything that's already covered in the switch exam and the route exam. So we will talk about later some additional troubleshooting tools, but as I'm going through a lot of the examples for the layer 2 LAN switching and the layer 3 routing, we're already going to be covering a lot of the troubleshooting for these different topics. So there is a separate section that I have set aside for troubleshooting, but it's one of those things that it's hard to prepare just for this exam versus the other two. It's kind of more that if you study correctly for switch and for route, then you're automatically going to know the stuff that's covered in the troubleshooting exam. So as we are going through these topics, the actual class format is going to be a little bit of a mix, where there are some slides that I'm going to go through that talk about the technologies, and we'll go through the details of like how EHRP does its path calculation different than OSPF or BGP, or how we can change how spanning trees path selection works. But a lot of the times I'm also going to be showing examples live on the command line, where we're actually building these networks, going through the different configuration commands, the different show commands, the different verifications. So as I mentioned, everyone is going to have equipment access, and then if you want to follow along with that now, you'll have access to do that. But then also I'm going to be assigning everyone additional time after class. So based on your own schedule, you'll be able to come back and go through these different examples that I'm doing. A couple things about different resources. For general networking topics, which a lot of these exams are going to cover, both from layer 2 LAN switching and then layer 3 routing, there's a couple common texts that probably some of you are familiar with seeing these over the years, but I always like to recommend these three if you haven't seen these before. Either TCP/IP Illustrated, Internetworking with TCP/IP, and then Interconnections. Pretty much any of these three books are going to be a really great foundation for any of the layer 2 LAN switching or the layer 3 IP routing. Because the specification for IP networking 20 years ago is the same specification as it is today. Now, obviously, some things have changed over the years, but really the core fundamentals of this stuff haven't changed. So you don't necessarily need like the latest and greatest CCNP exam certification guide in order to learn this stuff. A lot of this stuff is covered in some of these classical texts. In the case of the actual exam-focused things, there's two different variations that Cisco Press does. There's an authorized self-study, and then there's an exam certification guide. Everyone is also going to get a copy of this set for this class. Either later today or tomorrow, these books should show up. So after class, that'll be one resource you can go through the exam certification guides. And if you go to Cisco Press's website, it's kind of self-explanatory which books are going to fall into this category. So if you go to ciscopress.com, then under certification, they'll have a section for CCNP routing and switching. And what are the different books. So you'll see they have other stuff like the flashcards or the quick reference guide. This stuff is good, but you can't really use this as you're learning the technologies or as you're learning the topics. So this would be something that you would want to use as one of your last steps before taking the exam. But this first one, the official exam certification guide or the foundation learning guides, these are really the two that are going to make up the vast majority of the explanations of the topics. So this series here, the official certification guide, everyone's going to get a hard copy of this. But there's another great resource that is Safari Books Online, which is the publisher of Cisco Press. And with Safari Online, basically you can get access to almost all of the Cisco Press books and a lot of other different vendor topics and just a lot of just general IT stuff. But what's great about this is that if you're looking for a very specific topic, in the printed material, a lot of times it's hard to actually find what you're looking for to begin with. But let's say we're trying to figure out how does maybe rapid spanning tree protocol work. Where if you have a Safari account and you search for it, it's going to send you to that specific chapter that's talking about that individual topic. So you'll see that this one is the Foundation Learning Guides for CCNP, but there's all sorts of other books that cover these topics. So at least in my personal experience, what I'd like to do is read a topic by one author, then read it by somebody else to try to get a couple different perspectives on how it works. Because we'll see that a lot of these topics, they're not specific to Cisco. Most of them are vendor independent. Like if you were to implement OSPF on Juniper routers versus Cisco routers, the syntax is going to be different, but behind the scenes it's really doing the same thing. So you'll see that this book series, the O'Reilly books where they have like the different animals on the front of them, a lot of these are really good for the Cisco material, along with the Cisco Press books. But definitely this is a great resource because it can save you a lot of time to take you just to the particular technology or just the particular topic that you want. And a lot of times when you look at this too, like if you were to buy this printed set in the bookstore, it's probably going to be about $100 anyways. You may find your time is better spent getting like a 2 or 3 month subscription to Safari as opposed to buying tons of these printed books. But you can also get to this from Cisco Press's website, which is Safari Books Online. A couple other ones that I would recommend here are the Cisco LAN switching book, which is a little bit older now, and it goes over the syntax that we're not going to be using, where it covers the cat OS syntax or the set-based command line. But this book here is Cisco LAN switching, actually not that one. It is Cisco LAN switching CCI professional development. So the book is a little bit older. You can see it's from 1999. But the key is that the fundamentals of layer 2 Ethernet networks haven't changed in the past 20 years. So when you're looking at how does the switch build its CAM table or its MAC address table, or how does common spanning tree work differently than per VLAN spanning tree, this book is a great resource for a lot of those foundational topics. Just when you get to his configuration examples, you wouldn't want to go through that because that's for some of the older platforms. The other two that are great are Routing TCP/IP Volume 1 and 2. These are basically like the Bibles of IP routing for Cisco's implementation. And again, all of these are going to be available on Safari as well. So routing TCP/IP. This one here, where the first volume goes over the IGPs. So like basics of IP networking, TCP networking, static routing, the dynamic protocols, RIP, EHRP, OSPF. This is mainly going to be the focus of the first volume. Second volume is going to cover BGP, multicast, and then some other advanced routing topics. So definitely this is a great resource. This is the one that I originally used when I went for the routing exam for CCNP. And if you really understand the topics that are covered in this, then it's going to take you way above and beyond what's needed for the CCNP exam. So you can focus on either one. You could look at the exam-specific ones. These are kind of a more narrow perspective, though, where their goal, as you could probably guess, the exam certification guide, this is just to get you to pass the exam. But if you learn the technologies with something like this or just general IP networking, then it really doesn't matter what the questions are in the exam. You should be able to reason through them and figure out what they're asking for.
So if I really wanted to pick one, I'd just skip by TCP/IP running one.
Personally, that's where I would start. I would almost skip this completely and use it as just like a last-minute review, because this will really teach you the fundamentals, and then you can go through like the flashcards or some of the exam stuff towards the very end of your preparation.
Question?
Yes?
So I know there are online practice tests, but are there
Right.
online practice tests that include the
I'm not 100% sure if you mean like the simulations. I'm not 100% sure if they do, but the exam certification guides that we're going to get, they should have a CD with them that covers some of that stuff. So we'll have to check that out when the books come in. But the live examples, we're going to be going through tons of those this week. So after class, there'll be a set of labs that you can go through afterwards. That's really what's going to help you to prepare for those type of questions. Which actually leads us to our next topic here, which is going to be the hardware stuff. So as I mentioned, everyone is going to have access to equipment this week to go through the material. The problem is, most of the time you're going to be listening to me, though, as opposed to doing this stuff yourself. So you can follow along, but you'll see that the pace of the class is going to be fairly quick because there's a lot of stuff that I have to get through. But you'll have access to go through this stuff afterwards. And there's generally 3 ways that you can do this. You could either build your own lab, like if you have access to it at work or home. You could rent rack time, which I'll go through a little bit later today. You can use our racks for access. There's a number of other vendors that offer this. Or you could use a software that is known as either Dynamips or GNS3. This is like the equivalent of VMware for iOS. Where if you haven't seen this before, basically what it does is it emulates the hardware. Just like a hypervisor for VMware does, it's trying to emulate your underlying PC's hardware, and then you can run Windows or whatever on top of it. Basically, Dynamips is doing the same thing, where it emulates a bunch of different router hardwares like 2600s, 3600s, 3700s, and 7200s. There's some other minor ones in there. But as long as you have an iOS image, you can basically run multiple instances of the routers on your PC, like on your Windows laptop or your Mac machine. And then you could do a lot of these examples in that as well. So if you haven't seen this, and I'll go into some more specifics of this later in the week, but if you just search for either Dynamips or GNS3, GNS3 is a GUI interface for the program, where behind the scenes it's running the command line program Dynamips. You can use either or. A lot of times when you're first starting with it, this is easier to figure out how it works. If you were to also search for CCIE and Dynamips, there's 2 documents, 2 different write-ups I have here. Using Dynamips for CCI lab preparation at PC. This would be the same for CCNP studies as well. So there's some videos here that I go through that show you how to do the install, how to do the basic setup of this. If anyone has questions on it this week, let me know. I'm more than happy to take a look. But the idea behind this is that since it's emulating the actual iOS, or excuse me, it's emulating the hardware. It's not emulating the iOS. You run the normal image on the emulator, so it means all the commands are going to be available. Where when you look at some of the exam simulators, that's like a flash-based simulation that someone wrote for iOS, the problem with those is that no one's going to write a full simulation of every iOS feature. So in the case of CCNP preparation, I would recommend to stay away from those exam simulators or the iOS simulators. For some basic preparation like CCENT or CCNA, those are good. But for any of the advanced topics that we're going to get into, you're going to find it's just going to be more frustrating than it's worth. So if you don't have real equipment, this is going to be another great option. Whereas Cisco actually has their own version of this, which is called IOU. It's iOS on Unix. Basically, it's just a regular iOS image, but it's compiled to run on Unix as opposed to compiled to run on their hardware. And you could actually rent rack time from them in order to do this as well. And if you look at the Cisco Learning Network, there's some information on how you can do that to rent their virtual equipment. The only shortcoming of this, though, is that there's no Catalyst iOS. So the layer 2 switching is going to be severely limited when you look at the router's syntax versus the switches. Sometimes what people will do is run a combination of the virtual routers and the physical switches. You'll see there's a bunch of write-ups on that on our support forum, the IEOC one. But basically what you could do is get your your PC or your Mac OS machine that's running either Dynamips or GNS3. And then have a bunch of NIC cards that come out of this going into the different switches. And you can run these in hardware. So for testing, it works great. The only thing is that if you actually try to use it as a router, it's not going to forward traffic very quickly. So it's just for studying purposes. It's not going to be like some of those Linux-based routers, like the open source ones. But you can basically take these hardware interfaces and then bind them into the software. So it would look like, from a logical networking point of view, that a router 1 is physically attached to switch 1. And then we can configure whatever we want in the virtual router. So this portion here would be running in Dynamips. And then these would be running in hardware, the switches. Where the platforms that we're going to be using this week, the routers are going to be a mix of 2600s, 1800s, and 2800s. The switches are going to be a mix of 3550s and 3560s, which are layer 3 switching platforms. So you can run both layer 2 switching on them, and you can run layer 3 routing. Dynamips does fine with emulating the 2600s or the 3800, or excuse me, the 3700s, which can run a little bit newer code, but they can't emulate these, which becomes part of a problem, especially for this switching exam. So like I said, if you have questions about this throughout the week, we can look at some examples about how to set it up. But after class, this will make a little bit more sense why you need to get access to the hardware to go through some of these examples.
So is CatOS still on exams?
CatOS is not on the exams anymore, just Catalyst iOS. Okay, any questions up to this point on the general flow of class or what we're going to be covering? Any general questions?
Is multicast covered in the scope of CCNP?
I don't believe that it is. Let's double check the route exam, where it used to be specifically listed that it was, and then they removed it. So it was covered in the BSCI exam, which was the previous version of this. So for routing, they have EDGRP, OSPF, BGP, IPv6, IPv4 and IPv6 redistribution, layer 3 path control. So multicast is not going to be tested on.
About the VRF and MPLS?
Not for MPLS is not going to be tested either. MPLS would be part of the CCIP, the service provider set. And then it's actually kind of strange that multicast isn't tested in this exam, because multicast generally is an enterprise topic. It is in CCI routing and switching, but it's not in CCNP anymore. And then it would also be part of the service provider scope as well. But if you do want more information on that, I have a separate class that's just on multicast under Technologies Multicast. And then this is it's like a 15-hour class or so on multicast topics. This is also covered in, there's 2 books on this. Routing TCP/IP Volume 2 covers multicast really good. And then there's a Cisco IP multicast book. Configuring IP, no, not that one. Cisco Press. Developing IP multicast networks. And this one is, again, a little bit older, 1999. But most of the topics haven't really changed for multicast routing.